Hey everybody, and thanks for joining me today on my channel Outside with Jeff. Today it's January 2nd. Probably a great time. People are making New Year's resolutions. Perhaps you want to make one for the garden, such as starting a compost. Well, I've accumulated some questions and I want to go over the top 10 or so questions when it comes to composting. So let's get right into it. Do you need a bin to make compost? You don't need a bin, you don't need a special gadget, you don't need anything like that. If you think about it, nature composts all on its own in the woods. However, I like to use like a 3-walled bin setup just to keep everything nice and contained, and it helps me when I go to flip from one bin to another to rotate the compost. So you don't need a bin, but it can be helpful, especially to help you keep it nice and organized. Where's the best place to put a compost pile? You don't want a spot that's going to be full shade because it's going to slow down the composting speed of things. It's going to slow things down. So you want to pick a full sun position. You want to avoid trees and shrubs that'll try to grow the roots up into the pile, and then it's gonna be an inconvenience when you go to have to flip things, move things around. What's the easiest way to compost yard waste and food waste? Well, I like to just add them directly into the garden as long as I have at least 3 months until it's time to plant. Otherwise, I just take my food waste and I'll put them on top of the compost pile, and then I will just kind of flip it, incorporate it in, just so the food scraps aren't directly on top, because I don't want birds to come down and just eat all the food scraps. I want them to actually decompose and become part of my compost. So if you just throw them on top, birds will come in, and yes, they will produce some waste while they're feeding, but they're going to end up carrying most of the food away. You're not really going to get the full benefit of having your food trying to compost. Can you compost in the winter? That's a good question. So you can. I compost year round. I will tell you that in the colder months, things are going to compost a lot slower, but it was negative 25 degrees 10 days ago. And today, when I took my compost out and incorporated it, there was a lot of earthworm activity. So when it gets real cold, the earthworms and decomposing bugs and things, they're gonna just go really deep into the soil to escape that cold. But as soon as things warm up slightly, they're gonna come right back up and continue feeding on whatever you have in your compost pile. So don't stop composting when it gets colder. Just know that it's gonna take longer because there's not gonna be as much activity, whether that be bacterial or actually critters and earthworms and things like that feeding on the compost. What do you do if your pile has an odor? Well, most likely if your pile has an odor, then you have something's off balance. It's probably too wet and you have the wrong kind of bacteria in your pile. Good news is it's easy to rectify. You can add some more dry material and incorporate that in, flip it, or you can simply, if it's anaerobic, it means it's without oxygen, and you just need to turn your pile, and that's gonna get oxygen in there, and it's gonna get rid of the smell. So it's easier to prevent this issue just by turning your pile occasionally and not allowing it to get too wet. So like if you're in an area that you get an insane amount of rain, you definitely want to try to cover it partially or flip it more often so that it doesn't just become an anaerobic just mess. So should you wear gloves to handle the compost? I never wear gloves when I handle my compost. As long as you haven't composted pet manure, which I do not recommend, then there's no need to wear gloves. So finished compost will be handled just as you would garden soil. So as long as you're not putting cat litter, dog poop, things like that in there, you shouldn't worry about it. As long as it's just garden waste, garden scraps, leaves, yard waste, food scraps, you're fine. How can kitchen waste be stored for later composting? So say you have 2 foot of snow outside and you don't have any way to get to your compost pile. I would recommend just freezing your compost if you have freezer space. I have a large Folgers can like you'd get from a big box store. This came from, I believe, Sam's. It's like a 36-ounce coffee container. It's really big. That's what I put all my compost in. and I try to empty it once it's full. However, sometimes if it happens to get filled up and we're having a large amount of rain or it's insanely cold, I'll just delay taking it. And in that case, I'll actually just end up throwing away the couple days of compost that I'm not composting. I don't feel bad about that because honestly, we compost, I would say 90% of our food waste. So I'm not really concerned if there's a day or two of the year or a day or two of the month that I'm not composting. I don't feel guilty about that, and you shouldn't either. But if you really want to just be able to store things until you can get to your pile for whatever reason, you can toss them in the freezer and that'll be just fine. Should you add ground limestone, soil, or fertilizer to your compost? So a perfectly good compost pile can be built out of nothing fancier than leaves and grass clippings. So whenever I started my compost pile, that's all it was. It was leaves, some twigs, and grass clippings. My neighbor bags her grass. She puts it in a pile right next to my compost, and I add it to my compost pile. I have shrubs that I trim twice a year. They're like evergreen bushes. They grow really big. They get in the way. I trim those twice a year. I put my garden waste in there. But you don't need like any special starter. If you have some soil that isn't the best, you could add some to your compost pile, and that will help the worms and things come into it a little bit quicker, maybe just by a few days. And it's not really going to speed up your compost end result, but if you want to do that, you can. You don't have to. One thing you can do is when you start it on the ground, if you want to incorporate some of the soil that's directly under your compost pile location, you can do that. I did do that when I first started. I took like that first 6 inches of soil, the topsoil essentially, from the compost pile area and incorporated that into my pile so that as things developed and that compost would be ready, I would be using that topsoil as well. So you could do that, but you don't need to add any limestone, and it would be completely pointless to add fertilizer because you're creating fertilizer. So if you're gonna have like inorganic fertilizer, you shouldn't add that to your compost pile. It's going to do nothing at all that's going to be beneficial. If anything, it's going to affect some of your bacteria and things like that, so you wouldn't want to do that. Now, like adding bone meal, blood meal, things like that, it would just kind of be pointless because I would rather just add like chicken bones and beefsteak bones and things like that. That's going to create my own bone meal. Whenever I go fishing, which it's only been a few, I haven't cleaned any fish this year, but in years past when I'd clean fish, I'd bring the remaining from the cleaning process, add that to the compost pile and bury it in the center of it. So that's my blood meal. So I would not recommend adding organic or inorganic fertilizers to your compost pile. It's not going to add anything to it. Next, what do you do if the compost pile is not heating up? Well, two things are most likely happening there. You don't have enough green material, meaning like fresh green grass clippings, things like that. That is what's going to heat up the pile, or you don't have enough moisture. If your pile is just really dry, it's not going to heat up. So I would recommend adding more grass clippings and just spraying it down, hosing it down, and that should help it heat up. And if that does help it, it's going to help it within 48 hours. So you could add some green grass clippings and hose it down, come back and kind of split the middle of the pile about 2 days later and feel the inside of it and see if it's warming up. And if it is, you're doing fantastic. If it's not, don't worry about it because you can cold compost just as effectively as hot composting. It just takes longer. So how do you compost with too many high nitrogen? So if you don't have a lot of browns, if you don't have a lot of leaves, twigs, paper, you can definitely you can just compost with greens, but it does do best if it's a well balanced. I don't go out there and do like a handful of browns, a handful of greens. It's not like the end of the world, but you don't want to have like 95% green and 5% brown. Just try to keep it as evenly as possible and you'll be fine. Let's see, when is compost finished and safe to use? So an active compost pile fails to heat up anymore, then it's considered finished. So basically, whenever you start your compost pile, the inside, it's going to start, bacteria is going to kick in, and it's going to start warming up. And then after a week or so, you'll turn it, it's going to heat up again, and then a few weeks later, you'll turn it, it's going to heat up again. And then once that is no longer heating up, then everything that's going to break down is broken down. But I like to just go out there and turn mine over just once every month or so, sometimes every 2 months. And I just take I have like a hay fork out there. I just go out there and split it around a little bit, turn it around a little bit, and you'll know when it's almost finished because it's gonna look like leaf mold or like little bitty particulates. It's not gonna look as fine as compost like from the store or like manure or topsoil, but you're definitely gonna be able to tell that you've got something that looks like soil. It's kind of be like if you went to the woods and you pulled away all the leaves, it'd be like that top ½ inch of just really mealy soil. And that's what you're looking for in your finished compost. Let's see, does your compost need to be sterilized or screened? So I've never screened or sterilized my compost. If you didn't want little chunks of bark and little twigs and things like that to be incorporated into your garden, then yes, you could screen it, because all you're going to be doing is you're going to be letting all the finer material through. You can do that by building a screen out of a wooden frame, screen material, staple it to it, and then you would put that over a wheelbarrow. You would put some of your compost material onto the screen and you would shake it like so, kind of like you were looking for gold or painting gold. And all your fine compost is going to fall into the wheelbarrow, and then you can incorporate it to the garden. For me, whenever I add my compost, I dig a trench into my garden and fill that trench with the compost, so I'm not just throwing the compost on top of the garden. So for me, it doesn't really matter. If you want to screen your fertilizer or screen your compost, you can, but it's definitely not a requirement. Do you still need to use fertilizer if you're also using compost? So the fertility of your compost is going to depend on the ingredients you're using to make your compost. So that's why I like to have my compost pile as the inputs as varied as possible. So when my neighbors rake up their leaves before they burn them, I go grab their leaves, because I'm getting the nutrients from their tree, which took from the sun, and from their ground, whatever nutrients are in their ground are now in those leaves, and those come to my pile. I take the leaves from my trees, put in my pile. My neighbor cuts her lawn clippings, so I'm getting nutrients from her yard. I'm getting all our food scrap waste. I'm getting the chicken bones, the beef bones, leftover meats, all kinds of things. So that's the blood meals, the bone meals eventually. So my compost, I feel like, is very varied. It's well diversified. So we will use some organic fertilizers, but I don't really feel it's absolutely necessary. Just want to look at what you're wanting to do. If your plants are suffering with just your compost in your garden soil, then you could look at, see what they're actually, the signs are, what kind of symptoms they are, if they're yellowing leaves and they need nitrogen, or if there's spots and they need phosphorus, or whatever it happens to be. Just treat the ailment instead of just doing a all-purpose. Just see what the plant's telling you and then go from there. Because if you have a healthy plant, it's going to be less susceptible to disease and pests. But if you have a plant that's kind of struggling, then a little bit of pest pressure is really going to hurt that plant. So you just want to make sure the plant has everything it needs. And the plant will tell you if it's struggling. It'll tell you leaf color. There's different, you can just look at the plant and then Google the symptoms, and you can tell, what's the issue here. Does it need more water? Does it need more nitrogen? Needs more phosphorus? Whatever the case may be. So just let the plant kind of tell you what it needs. Last is, what happens if I make too much compost? Well, let me tell you what. We have 4 raised beds, 2 in-ground gardens. We have about 60 foot of blackberries, and I grow around the perimeter. And I have 2 large compost piles. They're about 6 by 6, and they could be a maximum of about 4.5, 5 foot tall if full. Right now I have one of them completely filled, 3/4 that's finished compost. The other one's completely full, and it's completely unfinished compost. and I compost in the ground, and I've never have too much compost. Now, that's because whatever I have, I use. So I produce a lot of compost here, but I've never had too much. Now, our family size, we're a family of 6 people. We produce a lot of extra food scraps, paper, things like that that you can compost. I don't really see, unless I had a business that I was going to get like food scraps from and trying to compost that, I don't really see a single family unit or even a multi-family unit being able to produce more compost than you can handle. So I don't think that's going to be an issue, but if it is an issue for you, compost is so desired. You could go on Facebook or whatever your social media is and let them know, hey, I've got compost, local compost, and I want $5 for a 5-gallon barrel or $10 for a 5-gallon bucket or whatever. And you could definitely be able to get rid of the excess compost. So it's not like it's going to be stacking up and you're not going to be able to do anything with it. You're definitely going to be able to get rid of it, whether it be in your own gardens or your neighbor's gardens or a friend's garden or selling it through your social media. But well, that's all I have today to talk about compost. I have several videos on my channel about composting. I would definitely recommend you check some of those out. I probably have 10 or 12 different videos out there about composting. So, but yeah, I just thought I'd start the new year with this little video. So have a great day from my garden to yours.